The annual gala of Hartwell Dynamics was a spectacle like no other, the kind of event that defined success and power. Held in the grand ballroom of the Metropolitan Tower, it was an evening drenched in opulence. Crystal chandeliers cast shimmering light over a sea of designer gowns and tailored suits. Waiters glided through the crowd with trays of champagne flutes, while a string quartet played a haunting melody from a raised platform at the room's center. Mason Hartwell stood near the edge of the crowd, a glass of whiskey in hand. At 42, he was a man who commanded attention effortlessly. His square jaw and graying temples gave him an air of authority, while his piercing blue eyes missed little. This night, like so many before, was a testament to his success. Every detail of the gala bore his touch: the decor, the guest list, even the carefully curated menu. His eyes scanned the room, landing on his wife, Eleanor, across the ballroom. She was radiant as always, her crimson dress hugging her curves in all the right places. Her dark hair cascaded over her shoulders, catching the light as she turned her head to laugh. But it was the way she laughed, soft, slightly forced, that caught Mason's attention. She was speaking with Greg Whitman, the company's CFO, and one of Mason's most trusted allies. "What?" Greg leaned in slightly, his hand brushing Elena's arm as he spoke. Mason felt a flicker of something unease, perhaps? He dismissed it quickly. Elena and Greg had been part of his life for years, and trust was the cornerstone of their bond. Still, the interaction lingered in his mind as he watched Elena smile, though her eyes seemed distant. As the night wore on, Mason mingled with investors, exchanged pleasantries with board members, and basked in the accolades directed his way. Yet, his thoughts kept circling back to Elena. At one point he approached her and Greg. Their conversation halted abruptly, and Greg's usual confident demeanor seemed to falter. Mason dismissed the thought with a shake of his head. He was overthinking, surely. On the drive home, the silence between Mason and Eleanor was palpable. The city lights streaked past the car windows, and Mason stole a glance at his wife. She was scrolling through her phone, her face illuminated by the screen's glow. When they reached the estate, he leaned over and kissed her cheek, a simple, affectionate gesture. She stiffened, just barely, but enough for Mason to notice. That night, as he lay in bed, Mason stared at the ceiling, unable to shake the feeling that something was off. The laughter, the glance, the tension, it all felt wrong. His instincts, so reliable in business, whispered that the cracks in his seemingly perfect life were more than just superficial. They were a warning. The morning after the gala, Mason's mind was still restless. Years of sharp instincts honed in the corporate battlefield had taught him to trust his gut, and something about Elena's behavior gnawed at him. At first, he dismissed his concerns as paranoia. After all, he was a man accustomed to control, and perhaps his insecurities had simply latched on to a meaningless interaction. But the doubts refused to fade. Mason's schedule left little room for personal reflection. His day began early, packed with meetings, financial reports, and strategic planning sessions. Yet, in the brief lulls between obligations, his thoughts wandered back to Elena. He began to notice things he had previously overlooked. Her late-night absences, once dismissed as harmless social gatherings, suddenly seemed too frequent. Her excuses too rehearsed. Small inconsistencies in her stories nagged at him, like tiny splinters he couldn't ignore. The shift in his perception was subtle at first. Mason found himself paying closer attention to her movements, her tone, and even the way she handled her phone. He hadn't realized how guarded she had become until now. The device was always within her reach, its screen facing down whenever he was nearby. She had started taking calls in hushed tones, retreating to distant rooms or stepping outside. When Mason casually inquired who she'd been speaking to, her answers were vague, often deflecting the question entirely. As days turned into weeks, the unease began to fester. Mason's work required him to be meticulous, and soon he began applying the same methodical approach to his suspicions. He started with simple observations, noting her routines and comparing them to past patterns. The first red flag appeared when he realized her book club meetings happened on the same nights Greg had mysterious evening commitments. Coincidence, perhaps. But Mason didn't believe in coincidences. Quietly, he expanded his investigation. He reviewed his company's internal records, a task he had delegated to others for years. His focus was drawn to Greg Whitman. Greg had always been a reliable lieutenant, sharp, charismatic, and ambitious. Yet something about his recent behavior felt off. He was more guarded in meetings, his confident demeanor masking an edge of tension. Mason noticed that Greg avoided his gaze more often and seemed to rush through conversations that once flowed easily. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. Buried within the company's financial reports, Mason uncovered discrepancies that sent a chill down his spine. Funds had been siphoned from multiple accounts over the past 6 months, funneled into obscure shell companies. Upon closer examination, the shell firms had ties to a private consultancy that Greg had used for side projects in the past. Determined to confirm his suspicions, Mason hired a private investigator. He needed undeniable proof before taking action. The investigator worked quickly, compiling a dossier of evidence that revealed a betrayal deeper than Mason had anticipated. Eleanor and Greg were not only romantically involved, but had conspired to steal millions from Hartwell Dynamics. The discovery was a gut punch, shaking the foundation of trust Mason had built his empire on. As Mason sat in his study, piecing together the fragments of their deception, his emotions warred between fury and cold calculation. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was strategic, an attack on everything he had worked for. He knew one thing for certain: this wasn't just a battle for his marriage. It was a war for his empire. And Mason never lost wars. The trip to London was meant to be a pivotal moment for Mason's empire. Hartwell Dynamics was finalizing the acquisition of a promising AI startup, a deal Mason had personally spearheaded. The negotiations required his full attention, but his mind was elsewhere. The private investigator's report sat heavy in his briefcase, its contents already burned into his memory. Elena's betrayal wasn't just an affair. It was a meticulously planned conspiracy, one that involved his closest ally. Mason felt a storm brewing inside him, but he knew he couldn't afford to act without a clear plan. The days in London were a blur. Mason moved through meetings and presentations with mechanical precision, his usual sharp wit dulled by the weight of what he now knew. He managed to close the deal, but the victory felt hollow. Something inside him demanded he return home, a primal need to confront the people who had betrayed him. Cutting his trip short, Mason boarded the next flight back to New York, his mind racing with thoughts of what awaited him. Arriving at his Greenwich estate late at night, Mason made a deliberate decision not to announce his return. The sprawling mansion, usually a symbol of his success, now felt cold and unfamiliar. The staff had retired for the evening, leaving the house eerily quiet. Mason moved through the darkened halls, his footsteps muffled by the thick Persian rugs. A faint light from the upstairs master bedroom caught his attention, and his heart began to pound. Mason stopped immutably on the stairs. As he ascended the grand staircase, he could hear voices, muffled but unmistakable. The low timbre of Greg's voice sent a surge of anger through Mason, but he forced himself to remain calm. He had to see it with his own eyes. Pushing the door open, Mason was greeted by a tableau that confirmed his worst fears. Daynon was not permitted to visit the main library and draw his helping himself when his mother's 5 sons, Elena and Greg, froze, their faces a mixture of shock and fear. Mason stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable, though his piercing gaze burned with intensity. For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the distant rumble of thunder from the storm raging outside. Greg stammered, scrambling to cover himself with the bed's rumpled sheets. "Mason, this isn't what it looks like." He pointed to the side of the bed. "The dress on the floor is a black lacy dress." "Mason, this isn't what it looks like. I thought it matched your eyes." "It matched mine," Greg stammered. Mason silenced him with a raised hand, his voice cold and measured. "You think I didn't know? That I wouldn't find out? Uma Forte Prison, neighborhood. Mason nodded. Elena tried to speak, tears streaming down her face. Mason, please let me explain. There's nothing to explain, Mason interrupted, stepping further into the room. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a manila envelope, tossing it onto the bed. Its contents spilled out. Photographs, bank statements, and email transcripts, each piece of evidence a nail in their proverbial coffin. The weight of the betrayal settled over the room like a suffocating blanket. Mason's gaze shifted between the two of them, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. You thought you could steal from me, humiliate me, and walk away unscathed. You underestimated the wrong man. Dane's hand tightened on the woman's arm. For the first time, Mason allowed his fury to surface. But his rage wasn't explosive. It was cold, deliberate, and terrifying. As he turned and walked out of the room, Mason knew the storm he was about to unleash would be far more devastating than the one outside. Mason Hartwell had always believed that true power lay not in brute force, but in precision. As he stepped out of the bedroom, leaving Elena and Greg to grapple with the undeniable evidence of their betrayal, he didn't allow his emotions to cloud his judgment. The confrontation had been just the opening act. The real performance was about to begin. By the time he reached his study, his mind was already mapping out the steps to dismantle the lives of the two people who had dared to cross him. Seated at his polished mahogany desk, Mason opened his laptop and began executing his plan with surgical precision. He had spent years cultivating an image of himself as a fair but formidable leader, a man who rewarded loyalty and punished treachery. This betrayal, both personal and professional, would serve as a lesson to anyone who might consider following in Greg or Eleanor's footsteps. The first order of business was Greg. Mason contacted his legal team, a cadre of the most ruthless attorneys money could buy, instructing them to initiate proceedings to freeze Greg's assets. Armed with the investigator's report and the damning financial records, Mason provided them with an airtight case of embezzlement. He also drafted an urgent memo to the board of Hartwell Dynamics, detailing the evidence against Greg and recommending his immediate suspension pending investigation. But Mason wasn't content to stop at professional ruin. He wanted to make sure Greg's personal life would crumble too. Leveraging his extensive network of connections, he planted a carefully crafted story with the media. By dawn, the headlines would read of Greg Whitman's betrayal of trust, framing Mason as the wronged but resilient CEO fighting to protect his company. The narrative was perfect. Mason, the noble victim betrayed by his CFO and confidants. And Blake I had been bad enough over the years to answer the description of most any boss. Next, Mason turned his attention to Elena. Unlike Greg, she wasn't directly tied to the company's operations, but her betrayal cut deeper. Her actions had tarnished the sanctity of their marriage, and Mason was determined to ensure she walked away with nothing. He contacted his financial advisors to revoke her access to their joint accounts and freeze her personal credit cards. By morning, she would find herself without the means to sustain the lifestyle she had so readily enjoyed. Mason sent her a single text message: "You'll get nothing. Leave." The message was brief, cold, and final. Elena's reply came almost immediately, pleading, apologetic, desperate. Mason ignored it. He had no intention of engaging in a dialogue. The house, like the marriage, was no longer hers. By the time the sun rose, the wheels were already in motion. Greg was arrested before lunchtime, blindsided by the legal onslaught Mason had orchestrated. Elena, meanwhile, found herself locked out of every account and credit line she had relied on. As she stood in the doorway with her hastily packed suitcase, Mason didn't even glance in her direction. As the day unfolded, Mason's plan unfurled flawlessly, like a game of chess where every piece moved exactly as intended. He wasn't just retaliating. He was sending a message to anyone who might ever consider betraying him. His empire would not crumble under the weight of deceit. If anything, it would grow stronger. Compared to what those messages had been powerful, weeks after the storm of betrayal, Mason Hartwell found himself alone in his study. The grand estate was eerily quiet, a reflection of the void that had settled in his life. He had won, of course. Greg was facing criminal charges, his career in ruins. Elena had disappeared from his life, stripped of the privileges she had once taken for granted. The company was stable, the board reassured by Mason's swift and decisive actions, while to the women he had spent so many of the more harrowing weeks. Yet as Mason sat back in his leather chair, staring at the faint glow of his laptop screen, the triumph felt strangely hollow. He had been reviewing Greg's correspondence again, ensuring no loose ends remained. Meticulous as always, Mason scanned through the emails and financial records the private investigator had recovered. Most of it was exactly as he remembered, damning evidence of Greg's schemes. But then, almost hidden among the trove of files, an email caught his attention. Its subject line was innocuous, but the sender was someone Mason never expected. Marcus Tate, his longtime chief legal advisor. Mason opened the email, his heart sinking as he read. The exchange revealed that Marcus had been aware of Greg's embezzlement far earlier than Mason had suspected, and worse, he had facilitated some of the transactions. The language was coded, but Mason's sharp mind deciphered the implications easily. Marcus had not only betrayed him, but had played a pivotal role in enabling Greg's theft. It was a fresh wound, cutting as deeply as the first betrayal. For a moment, Mason simply stared at the screen, his emotions swirling. Rage, disappointment, and a strange sense of weariness vied for dominance. He had thought the battle was over, but it seemed the war for his empire was far from won. Betrayal wasn't confined to one act or one person. It was a contagion, spreading through his most trusted circle. Determined not to let this new revelation defeat him, Mason set about crafting his next move. He couldn't risk acting impulsively. This betrayal required an even more delicate hand. Unlike Greg, Marcus was a public-facing figure, a man whose downfall could send ripples through the company's image. Mason needed to ensure that his actions protected Hartwell Dynamics while extracting maximum retribution. Over the next few days, Mason quietly gathered evidence against Marcus. He unearthed financial discrepancies, conflicts of interest, and a series of unethical dealings that would destroy Marcus's career and credibility. Simultaneously, he began courting a replacement, a sharp, ambitious young lawyer who had impressed him during a recent acquisition. Mason worked tirelessly, often late into the night, ensuring every step of his plan was flawless. When the moment came, Mason executed with precision. A surprise board meeting was called, during which he presented the evidence against Marcus. The board members, still reeling from Greg's betrayal, were unanimous in their decision to terminate Marcus's employment. By the end of the day, Marcus was escorted out of the building, his reputation in tatters. Mason watched it all unfold from his office, his expression unreadable. The betrayal had cut deeper than he cared to admit, but he refused to let it define him. As he stared out the window at the city skyline, Mason allowed himself a grim smile. His empire would stand, but the lesson was clear. Trust was a fragile commodity, and power required constant vigilance. The war was not over, but Mason was ready for whatever came next.